Thanks for coming to discussion 4 of Deeper Questions. Today's topic is reading history. How does one seek truth in ancient texts? And we are tape recording this discussion like the others for to put on YouTube for other people to see later down the road. Today is a unique format from all the others. This is a one-part workshop on the study of history and the study of texts that builds off of our previous 2-part discussion on Scripture. We're going to look at some of the mechanics of it all today. And this is particularly designed for people who are in the process right now of dealing with either friends or family or neighbors who are particularly focused on ancient texts, and there's some sort of dispute between them on often a scriptural text, but perhaps not. And this will hopefully equip people to go into those conversations more fully prepared to understand what the different issues are on the table in those conversations. As I said before, we didn't have a previous group exercise that anyone needed to do anything for up front. It is all going to be part of today. So at the bottom of everyone's packet, you should have a copy of the first page of a New Testament. And what I want everyone to do is take a look at it and cross out anything that is not, that you think was not in the original manuscripts from which this translation comes. And I have pens.
Scratch through it?
Yeah, scratch out. There you go. I have, yeah, scratch. So leave behind only the parts that you think come from the original manuscript. Okay, this is interesting. Yeah, there are some differences. All right, so we're gonna later on we're going to examine why we did what we just did. So let me just start with a little bit of autobiographical background. Just like okay. Actually, let's actually leave it. Is there a doorstop?
Yeah, that might even open. No, there's something going on.
Okay. Yeah. Let's hope that the garbage can doesn't come by too frequently. So, to be a little autobiographical for a minute, I, like a lot of Americans, have been exposed to a lot of conversations and issues about texts and about Scripture and about its significance, about controversies about it. And so I've been exposed to a lot of the issues that go into studying those sorts of documents. And there was a point in my life when I felt that the process for studying a text was really focused to one particular layer of analysis. So I wrote a hypothetical ancient text that starts off, "It was then in the fullness of time that Bob, son of Fred, gathered to himself all of his descendants on the shore of the blue sea. He said to them, 'My time is come, and I desire now to impart unto you the wisdom of life.' Then these were his words." And then the text follows, and you have these words of wisdom for the remainder of the text. And for a period of time, I felt like the study of a text went into learning what the text says. So you read the first sentence, and it says, "Bob, son of Fred, gathered to himself all of his descendants." Then you conclude, okay, Bob, son of Fred, gathered to himself all of his descendants. Once in a while, you might run into a more complicated word. For instance, the word shore. Does that mean a beach? Does that mean a rocky shore? Does that mean a muddy shore? Does that mean a cliff face on the edge of water? And if it mattered, then you'd do some more investigation. You'd perhaps consult a second translation. You'd look up the original the original word in the original language and try and get a dictionary definition for it, or you would look at that other word in other contexts. But all you're really doing is learning what this text says. And at the end of the analysis, you have what it says. And that's very important. And as I said at the beginning, we're not going to be doing that analysis in these discussions, partially because it requires some language skills and so forth that are a bit just beyond the scope of what we can do. But I felt like what I was doing was too narrow to that, because at the end of the day, I learn what the text says. But I also have the questions about what the text is. For instance, it says that these are the words of Bob, son of Fred, but who wrote this? It implies it's toward the end of Bob's life, but if he has died shortly thereafter, who wrote this, and where do I find that out, and what clues can I get into that? So there are a series of questions about what the text is that we're going to be exploring today. And we're going to walk through 6 questions to ask a text. And we'll examine each one. Some will go into in more depth than others. But before proceeding, just wondered, from looking at that, does anyone have any initial thoughts into additional things they would want to know about a text like this? If you really cared about this thing and we're going to be examining it more, what more would you like to know?
The writing style at the time might help. I feel like today a lot of writing is kind of more brief and to the point than maybe, I don't know, 100 years ago when they would usually flowery language and lots of words.
Everything was more epic. It sounded more epic
Right.
and legendary than it was, and this
Yeah.
could be just that exact kind of fluff.
Yeah, because like when I see like
The
the
fullness.
first several words, like the fullness of time, like why,
That sounds like a
like why, what are they even saying? Like why are they even saying that? It seems unnecessary. If I was writing today, I would cut it out.
Yeah, so you're looking for, are there other contemporaneous texts that you would want to, that you could compare it to get a baseline of what's going on? Yeah, very good. Anything else anyone would want to know?
Where is this from?
Where is it from? Yeah.
Geographically and I guess historically, what was going on then and there.
Yeah, the context, where it's from, when it was written,
Yeah.
and so forth.
Is it just assumed that we, because if this is about a regular religious figure, we would know who Bob is, but who's Bob?
Yeah, who is Bob? Yeah.
Who's Bob and who's Fred?
Exactly.
Who that is?
Yeah, who are...
Why do I care that he's imparting wisdom to me if he's just some guy?
Right. Why does it matter?
Why do I crave his wisdom?
Excellent. That's a really good list. Anything else? Cool. All right. So that gives some, throws out a few different questions to ask up front, all of which are very important. And some of those are what we'll be looking at in some more detail here. Let's turn to page 27 of the discussion 4 handout. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to go through each question, and then I've created this table, which is a summary of what people's views are as to the answer to each question for all New Testament texts. Because since early Christian writings has been the case study that we've been using throughout the semester, this gives this is hopefully for those who are going to be going on to particularly have conversations with people about the New Testament. I'm hoping this is going to be a real good sort of cheat sheet, so to speak, for giving a sense of where the controversies lie and where they don't lie.
Is this every book, or is this just a particularly controversial one?
This is all of them,
Okay.
all 27. And the way that I've done this is for each question, for each book, I have put either an X or I have not put an X. Sometimes I put a footnote and explained my answer in some more detail. But I want to be very clear about what those two notations mean. An X does not mean that the text has that attribute. It means that there is a dispute out there about whether it has the attribute. You can go out there and you will find writing, you can find a book or an article or several articles fairly easily on both sides of the issue. There will be an alive debate, which will probably mean that will be a point where if you get in tension with someone, that'll probably be a point where you're going to be in, that will be a focus of tension. If there's not an X, if it's a blank field, then that means that there's really not a whole lot of debate. It doesn't mean that no one believes it has the attribute. There's always someone out there, but you're just not going to find a lot. And so and as a side note, for the previous sessions and for the future sessions, that means that anything that has a blank field, I've been assuming to be not at issue and just assuming in the presentations, because after so many people have looked at this stuff, there's been so much controversy, there continues to be so much controversy, and so if parts of these are not controversial, I'm just going to assume that we're good to go on that stuff. And so anticipate that A, in the course of your conversations with people, there won't be much controversy, or if you or the other person do stake out a claim on that issue, just recognize that one or the other is taking a pretty distinctly minority position. So that's giving us a sense, and we'll go back to this chart after each question. Any questions on that? I hope this, at least the chart itself, is fairly clear. So the first question to ask of a text that I have is the issue of fragmentation. Is the text physically fragmentary? And I have an old handout here. I have more in the materials on the details of this, but I thought I would just sort of give a quick, this is just a quick overview. If you take a piece of paper and you rip it in half like this, top to bottom, perpendicular to the lines, it sustains a pattern of damage that prevents you from reading any particular section. You just have half a line, then a gap, then half a line, then a gap. If you take a piece of paper, and you rip it like this, parallel to the lines, you have preserved for yourself the entirety of a portion of the text and none of the remainder. And an example of that is what we looked at last time, the Muratorian canon, this very important document that has its beginning missing. And so in the handout there I have some different, 5 different patterns of physical damage that a text can sustain of varying degrees, where the bottom is missing, half of it is missing vertically, the end is missing, there are little holes in it, and then your ever fun, where there's tiny little pieces that have sustained damage coming in from all 4 directions. And people make their living dealing with those little pieces of paper and trying to figure out what's going on. So the one question to ask yourself when you pull out an ancient text is this a fragmentary text? Is there a part missing? And particularly, is there a whole chunk at the bottom or the end missing? Because that will be the least obvious if you're just looking at a portion. If someone hands you a paragraph of it, it won't be necessarily apparent whether or not there's a part missing. if we look at the table on 27, there's not a whole lot of controversy here. I put one footnote. Some people think the second gospel has an end missing because it does come to a rather abrupt conclusion, but it does also come to a conclusion at the end of a full sentence. So there's been some conversation about whether that's because there once was some additional material. But other than that, there's just not a whole lot going on here. Thoughts on that?
When we have a whole page,
Mm-hmm.
is that still considered fragmentation if there could have been a page before or after it?
Yeah, that would be fragmentation.
That's what could be the case in Mark. You know, they just ended the page on a sentence
and then lost the next.
Right.
Yes, yes, that is a good point. If you have a collection of pages and there's a page missing, then yeah, that's the equivalent of ripping off the bottom. Yeah.
And it could be tricky, I imagine, even trickier to figure it out because you don't have that physical.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
And then does the absence of anything else even does it mean that there isn't? You know, that there is more? Yeah. Just always wondered.
Yeah, very good, very good point. And it depends. It also depends on the type of writing. If it's etched in stone, as opposed to if it's a codex where you do have individual pieces of paper, or a scroll where you have a lengthier piece of paper, then different issues come into play in those different physical forms.
Scrolls are awesome.
Huh.
Scrolls are awesome.
Yeah, they are pretty cool. They're pretty cool things. Other thoughts on that one? All right, that one was pretty straightforward. The next one also I think shouldn't take us too long. That's the issue of redaction. Redaction and fragmentation are the same thing in one sense, that there's material missing. With what we just looked at, it was unintentional. There's physical damage to the document. With redaction, there has been loss because someone chose to remove material. And in the graphic here, you'll see one scenario in which there's a longer document that someone wrote. Another person takes a shorter version of it and copies over some of the material, leaves the rest, and then all that you have left is the shorter version. And what's a common example of that today?
Horn books, summaries.
Yeah, that's a good one. In law books, you'll have
those literature you can get on any major literary classic. You can get that. I forget what it's called, but that
Cliff Notes.
Cliff Notes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cliff Notes are a good example. To the extent that it's just a raw summary.
Right, and they may miss specific elements from the story.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
it's not going to be worded the same way.
Right, and for our purposes, it does have to be.
Okay, right.
It has to be just strictly the original stuff. But if you do have a Cliff Notes that would have a summary of quotes, that would definitely count. And also kids' books, abridged children's books. If you publish the children's version of Robinson Crusoe or something, you just take a big thing, narrow it down a whole bunch, and then you release it. One of the issues, though, with that is that it's sometimes difficult to tell whether or not, if you're just looking at something, it's hard to tell, are you looking at the thing or are you looking at an abridged version of the thing? And I found with book tapes, once in a while, there'll be, if you listen to an abridged book tape, there'll be, the reader will just start off, read the copyright, read the title, and then go into it, and won't actually say it's abridged. And you have to look at the box, and sometimes in kind of small print on the back it says, abridged or something like that. So
make it more colloquial, perhaps.
Yeah.
Make it go faster.
But in earlier times, if someone was abridging, would they make a notation that they had abridged the text, or wouldn't they? It's not necessarily something that would be preserved, and if they did a good job of doing it streamless.
If their intention is specifically to avoid certain information, well, then obviously they're not going to say it's abridged. So.
Right. Depending on depending on their motivation.
Right.
If they just think, if there's a longer text and they think,
This
well,
is all that matters.
Yeah.
They may say this is an abridged, succinct version, but yeah, if like, you know, the way that one was done, if you're deliberately keeping some information out, I mean,
yeah.
I'm not going to tell you that I'm doing that. Why would I tell you? That's why I'm doing this.
Yeah, and there could be various motivations. It could be that the person just thought that there was unimportant material or only cared about the particular part. Could be that it was too tedious to keep the longer version and wanted to copy a shorter version. Or it could be that they were, you know, sort of in the children's scenario, they were writing for a more simplistic audience or whatever. If we look at the table, there is a little bit of debate on this issue. There are 4 texts where there's a question of redaction. The biggest one that seems to get people the most excited is the text that we call Paul's second letter to Corinth, which is a lengthy, that looks on its face to be a lengthy letter. But some people have argued that because some people read it and what they take away from it is that there are some real distinct tonal changes throughout the letter. He seems to be happy with the recipients at one point, seems to be very mad at them at some points. He seems to be very just distraught at some points. And so some people have argued, well, what we're actually looking at is that he wrote a collection of letters to them, and a later editor, for whatever reason, hacked the opening and closing off of all of them, kept one set, and then strung the bodies together, and made this much longer letter. And then there's all sorts of debate as to, among people who believe that, about which letter starts where and where it stops and so forth. So that's one thing to think about. And if you get into a conversation about one of those 4 texts, you may run into that issue. Other thoughts on that? All right, that one's also fairly straightforward. The next one is interpolation or a replication error, and that up on the screen here is the opposite phenomenon. There, you start with a shorter text. You take and then a later person then takes the text, copies it over, and in the process includes material that's new. And that additional material is what's called an interpolation or interpolated material. There are 2 scenarios in which this could happen. One is on purpose, where the person wanted to copy stuff over and then just add stuff, and that was the plan all along. And then another case is where there's error of some sort. It wasn't so much that he was intending the new material, but he messed up some material as he was copying it over. This tends to be if you look at the table on 27, there's not much. I'm saying that there's not much going on here. There's a little bit. There's a lot of debate about whether the 4th Gospel, 7:53 through 8:11, is interpolated. That's a particularly famous example. There's some things here and there where there's a couple instances of kind of a full paragraph. Some describe this issue in terms of any form of replication error as opposed to major replication error. I'm only talking about major replication error.
Like the entire essence of the story would change?
I think, how did I
Because
define?
In Old Testament analysis that I've done, I mean, there's huge debate over lots of terms, like a term that clearly has its root in, it means a female of some kind, but doesn't mean a whore, doesn't mean a girl, doesn't mean an elderly woman. And so these little, just translation potential errors can have huge consequences.
Right.
Even if the basic essence of the story is preserved, it's still, like if the word for Mary Magdalene, can be interpreted slightly differently, well then that changes the whole story.
Right.
So, is there really not? I guess you're saying that there's a lot of that.
There is a lot of, in terms of the word count, there's a lot of minor fluctuation.
Because if you give two people who speak Hebrew and English the same text and have them write it out, it's going to be about the same, but not the exact same.
Right.
Likely.
I think the issue here is, and what I'm trying to stay away from, and there have been some, well, once in a while you'll hear something like, there are, and then a number is said, and it tends to be like in the tens of thousands. There's 60,000 replication errors in the New Testament, or something like that. There's just these huge numbers. But what we're really talking about there are, you have a bunch of manuscripts, and if there's a particular word, and 58 of them agree on the word, 2 don't, then that word counts as a replication error. And then the next word, there's another split of 58 to 2 in some other combination. That's a replication. That's a replication variant. And so you can, when you have enough manuscripts, there'll be a replication variant, at least in one of them, at any given part, even if the very large majority of the texts are in one. Yeah. So the question is not so much whether there is an extant variant. The question is whether scholars feel comfortable making a finding as to what the correct variant is. And if you have and that goes way beyond what we can talk about. But often if it's the majority variant, they'll go with the majority variant over the special if it's a very tiny minority variant. So it's I think I want there. I'm urging for as you go into your future conversations with people, be careful about the numbers in this. There are a lot of numbers thrown around. Just be careful about that. There are in any New Testament translation that's good, you will see in the margin a notation for the textual variant, and they'll typically be on a given page. There'll be 2 minor ones. One is it said black and blue, and then they say, but there's a sizable minority of manuscripts say blue and black, and then a second one will be
things that don't eviscerate the essence of the story, but there's a couple.
There are a couple minor ones where there is a lot of content.
Can mean the world.
Right. So, which means that if your conversation starts to zero in on a particular, if not word, maybe phrase, and you're sitting there arguing with someone about a phrase, be sure to check what the position on any textual variant is on that phrase.
Know all the potential interpretation.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that? Additional thoughts?
There maybe be benefits of actually looking at benefits of looking at the other variations, because it can tell you about what the original author might have meant, because the people doing those interpretations closer to the date of the original might be likely to interpret it more accurately than somebody who's like 1,000 years later trying to interpret the same thing, because they would have a better idea of the context because it's closer in time.
That is a significant issue when you have a document that was written in one language, it was translated into another language. The original document survived. The original document is non-extant, and all that you have is the translation. And then you have to translate that second language into the third language, which is your own. And in that case, you're having to trust the translation abilities or not trust the translation abilities of that intervening translator, who would have to do interpretive work in terms of diction and so forth in that process. If you're dealing, though, with a copyist who's just staying in the same language, hopefully you can avoid that issue entirely. Is that kind of...
Because the person doing that is not supposed to be doing any sort of thinking about interpretation of it. He's just supposed to be copying. That's...
Yes, now, unless he views himself as a redactor or an interpolator, in which case he would be. But if he is just trying to be a copyist, then hopefully,
what
it's just
state
trying to be a
do
copyist.
most of these original texts come to us in? What language? What time period? Are they interpretations that are our originals? Or are they in what language?
Greek.
In Aramaic?
Greek. They're all 27, as far back as we can tell, are Greek. There's one or two that there's been some conversation about. There's a feel, and don't ask me how they feel it, because you'd have to know the language well. But a couple people feel like, this feels a bit more like it's not Greek, but it's a Greek translation of another language. There's one or two where some people think that.
Cool.
But the bulk of it is
we have
Greek.
a Greek version pretty much of all this.
Yeah. As far back as the earliest you go back on everything is
we
Greek.
assumed that was the language that it came in.
Yeah, and in the huge, I don't think anyone would dispute that in the large majority of the cases it was Greek originally, and then with a couple of those possible exceptions.
Got to educate the Jew.
Oh no, that's all right. Other thoughts? All right, this one's fairly straightforward, but the main thing to take away is I would just urge when people when you hear the big numbers, just get a good sense of what they're talking about when they throw out those big numbers. Because another thing, just as a side note, is if what you're doing is just counting textual variants, what's the end point on those? If a New York publisher prints off 100,000 Bibles tomorrow and there's a typo on page 782, that's a textual variant. So is that an additional? Are we continuing to accumulate textual variants? Because it seems like those numbers would not be worth much at all. So when someone throws out a number, what was their end point? And if it's really, really late, there were some textual variants created because someone messed up in the 17th century. Well, no one cares, because we have substantial records. No one translates off of something that late anyway, so it doesn't matter whether they messed up or not. So that's just something to keep in mind. So that one's fairly straightforward. The next one is I call it interrelationship or relationship to another text. And this is where it's essentially a fusion of, you could think of it sort of as a fusion of interpolation and redaction. It's what we would today call a remake of a text. Like we have a remake of a movie. A remake of a movie is not the original scenes with some taken out. It's also not the original scenes with some more scenes added. It's fully new, but at any given point there is a blend of continuity and discontinuity with the original. So one question to ask is this text that you're looking at, is it a remake of another text? And then that gives you some information. It gives you some information about, well, first of all, it gives you some information that the author was not writing fresh. Second, it gives you some information about the literary materials that the author had. The author had this earlier text, which tells you something about the author. And then third, if you've ever looked at drafts or looked at annotated drafts, you realize it's interesting when people make changes. I feel like when I read something like that, I get a really good sense directly into their brain. Oh, okay,
what was their goal?
Yeah, it was, and so when you compare the two, it's okay. They didn't care about this point, so they dropped it. They did care about that point, so they expanded it. They didn't like that word, so they put in this different word, and it gives a lot of insight into the author.
I know what you mean from FDR's speeches.
Oh, really? It was.
Yeah, he had writers, but then he would mark it up, and you would know what he was trying to do in that speech.
Yeah. So was it typed originally, and then
there's
handwriting on top of it?
Surprisingly decent handwriting. It's cool. You should check it out.
No, that's an excellent.
Because I guess when he can't get across to them in words, like, this is what I want to happen.
Yeah.
Well, then when he kills what you were doing and then does that, you know exactly where he's trying to go.
Yeah. No, that's a really cool example. If we look at the New Testament chart, there are three groupings of this phenomenon, and they're the ones that are all physically close to each other on the chart. So at the end, you have 2 Peter and Jude. There, if you read the second letter of Peter and you read the letter of Jude, you'll just see, oh, there's some stuff that's the same in them. If also with the letter to Colossae and the letter to Ephesus, there is some material in them that's just very similar. And then in the four Gospels, there's interrelationship. There's significant interrelationship. And if you look up on the screen, I've posted 3 passages. These are from the first 3 Gospels. Let me just read. I'll just read these out loud for our YouTube friends. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, "Who do you say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, but still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Second Gospel. Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others one of the prophets." And he continued by questioning, he continued by questioning them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." Third Gospel. And it happened that while he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he questioned them, saying, "Who do you people say that I am?" They answered him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others that one of the prophets of old has arisen again." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered and said, "The Christ of God." So notice that it's not that those passages are not just similar as to content, although they are. They're similar as to phraseology. They're similar as to the order of sentences, the grammatic structure within the sentences. Some clusters of words are completely the same, and I colored them there so you can see that there's this progression. There's a little introduction which varies. That's the part that varies the most from gospel to gospel. Then you have Jesus speaks to the disciples, very similar in each one. Then they respond, very similar in each one. He speaks again, very similar in each one. Then Peter speaks, very similar in each one. So what we have there is some sort of extensive relationship between these documents. And I have here, this is a fun book. This is a synopsis of the 4 Gospels. And it has broken them all together like this, where in different columns, all the overlapping material is put into columns. So I'll just pass that around. And as you look through it, you just see...
Is this your personal copy?
Yeah. The extensive, just how much material is related between them. So there's been tons of discussion and conversation about what that interrelationship is and the significance of it and so forth. And that will come up, that probably will come up a fair amount in certain types of conversations that people have. Any thoughts on that? That one's fairly straightforward.
Well,
yeah.
What are some of the, I guess, the hypotheses as to why there's so much of the same stuff covered? Is it just that important that we have to hear it 4 times? I doubt that's it.
I don't know if I'd call it the dominant theory. There's a big theory that's out there that you'll run into a lot that's called the two-source theory. And it goes beyond, the full scope of it goes beyond what we could look at today. But for this, what we just looked at, the theory would hold that the author of the first and the third each had a copy of the second and were writing independent of each other.
Okay.
So the second one came first, 2 copies went out separately.
So 2 people were just referring to the same thing?
Yeah.
Individually?
Yeah. And so...
Because the remainder of the books, they have their own subject matter, no? Or are they all basically the same story?
In the
Gospels?
There is... Some of them have unique material. The 4th Gospel is the most distinct from the other 4. It has some overlapping material, but a lot of it is completely unique to itself.
Was each one meant at that point, I guess, to be a summation of, the religion as it was at that moment? Were they all basically trying to achieve the same purpose?
One of the interesting things, and it's something we touched on in the second session, is that in Gospels 1 and 2, there's no conversation that the author has about the purpose for writing. He just goes straight into it.
Right.
And in Gospel 3 and 4, and we looked at 3, we didn't look at 4. Gospel 3 has an introduction, and he sits there and he talks about why he's writing, and he refers to there's been some previous documents, and he wants to make one of his own, and he wants to make it. I'd have to pull up the wording that he uses for his goals for the document, but he talks about that. And then the 4th Gospel, there's some discussion at the end about that's self-referential, and there's some conversation about that. So that's all you can glean in terms of from the texts themselves. But it's an interesting question. Did they each write because they disliked what the other wrote? Were they thinking that theirs was a complement and they wanted both? Once they'd written theirs, they wanted that and the other one to go out kind of as a pair? Those are significant questions and open questions, and you'll see a lot of debate about that. Is that sort of... Mm-hmm. Okay. Cool. Other thoughts? All right, so that's those are our first 4 questions. We now move to the 5th, which we're going to spend the bulk of our time on here. Pseudepigraphy. And this is a fun, long word. And we're going to... I want us to sort of ease into this by way of some examples. And we're going to sort of look at some examples, and I'll hopefully get us a definition here after a little bit. I've read a couple of his poems.
It's not his real name. Is it?
Oh, okay.
He even writes it with lowercase e's, I'm pretty sure. It's
yeah.
It's not his name.
Yeah,
but he's not purporting to be someone else. He's just
right.
It's a pseudonym.
And that's the big difference.
Pseudepigraphy. That's just hiding your own identity as opposed to, I guess.
Unless, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think if through history that fact was lost, and the fact that you were and there's some significance that hinges on whether it's a pseudonym or not,
okay, then
you might consider it pseudepigraphy at that point.
Because, well, I think that would usually rely on, is there significance to the, I guess, changing the identity of the writer. So, like, I'm just thinking, right. Mary Cassatt, female painter, signed it with a different name because people wouldn't buy a female painter's painting.
Yeah, that.
So there's, I mean, there's motivation there, and it's beyond just she wants to be anonymous. She wants to be taken seriously.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. In the pseudepigraphy that I've studied, it's generally that the author is.
They're trying to gain more credibility by being someone else,
but being another real person.
Right.
And if you, and I guess
someone who has a lot of scholarly academic cred.
And I think when you use the phrase pseudonym, that just means that you're making up the person, right? Yeah, and that's a little. I don't know. I get you might call that pseudepigraphy or not.
Samuel Clemens.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know his motivation for that. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. If
Benjamin Franklin.
What is it? Mark Twain. That's the water depth, right?
Yeah, it has something to do with the big boats.
Yeah. So did you just like the name or something?
I don't know.
Yeah, but that's a really interesting.
Poor Richard's Almanac. Why? Well, that one was because he didn't want people to know it was him.
Okay.
Ben Franklin, because he knew anything he writes is going to sell like hotcakes.
Yeah. What
if it's a poignant writing without his name on it, and it did sell like hotcakes? So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point. In this time period, which is the time period I know about, and I don't know as much about most others. I'm trying to think if that sort of pseudonym activity. I can't think of an instance of that offhand. I mean, I know in American literature, yeah, it's a bigger deal. Huh. I'll have to think about that. That's an interesting thought. I'm going to show you guys this video. Hopefully, I'm going to turn this. I think it's.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, I don't know if there's. I don't know if they have the release date out yet or not. But have you guys heard about this?
No, that's amazing. A slasher flick with Abraham.
I saw.
Tim Burton too.
Yeah, I know I'd promised to only use materials that I had included in the handout, but I saw this last week and I thought this is just so precious that it's
Tim Burton's mocking the scene while also using it to make lots of money. He's really good at that.
Yeah, I thought that was just amazing. So, but as I understand it, a book was written a couple years ago called Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Which is, and basically the premise of it is that he wrote a diary that he gave to, I think he actually gave it to a vampire, a good vampire or something, and then that's passed down, and this author, I forget his name or her name, has now written a book based on the diary of Abraham Lincoln. And so now I guess the Civil War was actually the real Civil War was about knocking out vampires, and Abraham Lincoln was actually a superhero with this incredible strength who was fighting against the vampires. And so now there's a movie about it.
So they can question that black and white stuff. Give them an elementary school.
There's another clip they've released. It's two where it's him wrestling a vampire for about 2 minutes in the White House, and he ultimately takes the guy out with an axe. But so the basic question for our purposes is, was that true or was it untrue?
Very untrue.
Very untrue. But
it's not a trick question.
well, does Abraham Lincoln look like that? I mean, minus the muscular arms. What was
I mean, generally,
the beard.
Yeah.
they got a guy that looks like him and got the hair fairly correct. I've seen quite a few photos of him. And they do the generic top hat, which he didn't always wear, but he did wear fairly frequently.
Yeah. So
as was the style.
So it's true as to what he looked like, more or less. And it's true as to the clothing, more or less.
And the battlefield looked pretty accurate. All the...
So as to the times...
Yeah, the historical
scenery.
accuracy seems good. Whoever the quality control person was.
Yeah, in a macro sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Washington Memorial, which I don't know if
it wasn't fully completed.
Yeah, I
stopped.
think that...
That's why there's that line that's different. You can see it. It's like only a third of the way up. They had to chill.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was during the Civil War, and then they finished it. So
yeah.
That's the only... You're right.
So it's kind of some interesting stuff. Well, let me ask people, let's say that the second inaugural gets lost, the Gettysburg Address gets lost, and all the records about Abraham Lincoln get lost, except for Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. And in the distant future, if you're a historian, and all you had was, let's say you had a map of the United States. You kind of knew where the cities were. You knew, for instance, that Atlanta is Atlanta. And you know that much. And you have that much information, plus you have Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. How well could you reconstruct the 1860s?
You could take away all the things that you'd think were impossible. Like vampires, you might be like, oh, there's no vampires, so I'm going to take that out of the reconstruction. The other parts, I wouldn't know.
Well, you're gonna be fair. You're gonna be close. You just are gonna have a few gaping, huge errors.
Yeah.
I mean, like I guess the setting wise, you'll get it right, but the overall essence of the time, you're just totally off.
So a sociologist might do better if they're worrying about clothing and transportation.
Yeah.
And
if you're just wearing like a
not the train that was blowing up.
An archaeologist would be able to recreate it pretty well in his field.
Yeah,
but yes, someone approaching it. Other disciplines, like sociology, I mean, you might get it wrong. I mean, I just don't know how they'd even approach the fact that vampires don't exist. And I imagine they still won't in their time.
Yeah.
So...
Could you use it as evidence that vampires used to exist?
Right, that's what I'm worried about. I imagine some people would freak out,
Right now, when I try to reconstruct past things, I think like walking on water. Like, oh, Jesus didn't walk on water because you can't walk on water.
I don't know, I think people do this. I mean, subconsciously, like when I think of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, it's got a hint of 300 to it, and a bit of Gladiator to it, and a bit of the very generic black and white stuff that I've been taught. So, to an extent, it wouldn't be that... It would be pretty understandable if they thought that was a legitimate historical fact.
Yeah.
Just maybe the way that we view primitive legends that explain their morality and the reason they're alive, that's how we kind of explain the elements that don't make sense to us, and they might do that.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I think there's probably going to be a difference between, how a historian, the story that a historian makes out of it versus like somebody from the general population.
Right, whether a layman just picking up the text and reading it as
'cause
opposed to a historian,
Because I'm likely to be influenced by by this mix of information, like you're kind of saying, like, I have the things that they taught me in school and the things I'm like learning from like movies and video games, and in my mind that sort of the video games and stuff is bringing in a lot of those sort of emotional human components that I'm attaching to these historical facts, and
I think
whether they're actually accurate
somehow something that we have what we think is a clear-cut conception of in our minds, we really just have an Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter version of from the past. I'm not kidding.
Well said.
Yeah, like something that we probably hold to be very just, we don't even not going to discuss it because it's such a basic, intuitive, just, it exists, it's a fact, but it's,
It's actually totally different.
Yeah, and I know that probably our conception of older cultures that especially the classical cultures that other, recent generations have romanticized to the point that it's like the end-all be-all of the academic world, so... Yeah. I doubt we have a very good conception of the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks, or the lay people do.
Well, it goes to show that when you look at sources, that truth and non-truth can be blended in very subtle ways.
To make it hard to tell after the fact.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely.
Let me do another quick example here. It's going to have a very different tone than the...
This little house? Nice.
Yeah. I guess we can see that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus I know what it is.
Did,
My mom watched it.
Okay.
Plus I think it was on Nick at Night.
Oh, was it?
Like I Love Lucy. I've seen almost every episode of that.
I don't listen.
Yeah. I Love
That's
Lucy.
a funny show.
The Wonder Years. Amazing. I went just like that.
I did a good job too. What are you talking?
I love that guy, Fred, or whatever.
Yeah, that's it.
He directs every show I like at some point. Alright.
So I show that just for one reason, because I have a couple of sisters. So when I was younger, Laura Ingalls Wilder was a
Big T.
yeah, she was the big cheese in the family. But the interesting thing about that show is that Ingalls Wilder died in 1957. That show came on in 1974, less than 20 years after she died. And if you watch a few episodes of the show, and I've only watched a few episodes, but it's the blend of truth and non-truth is really remarkable, because on the one hand, all those people really existed, and her two sisters and her parents were real people, and she wrote about them a whole bunch. And in terms of the attire and the scenery, that's all going to be pretty accurate. But the episodes themselves, it's all fictional. I think maybe some of the episodes were based a little bit on her autobiographies, but it's this extensive body of fictional adventures of real people. Yeah,
and used it for their own thing.
Yeah, and so all that goes to show that I think when there are these sorts of conversations about these ancient texts, I think some people come into it and say, okay, let's take all the texts. Here, we'll put the true ones over here, we'll put the untrue ones over here. But in reality, it's the study of history is trying to reconstruct people from the little house on the... trying to reconstruct Laura Ingalls Wilder from from the TV show, not from her books, if the books don't survive, or trying to reconstruct Abraham Lincoln from Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. And that's a lot of what history is that sort of a task. It's pulling apart very, very deeply interwoven materials, and we still make them today. This isn't. It's not like long ago people made these weird texts. We do this all the time, even today, and depending on what survives and what does not in the future. I mean, in the last discussion we talked a lot about how more things going forward will probably tend to survive, unless there's cataclysmic stuff. But nonetheless, we still make this stuff. And depending on what ends up, be careful what you write down, because it might be the thing that survives.
They say more things will survive. Do you mean a greater percentage, or just more in general?
Probably both, I would imagine.
I'm going to say, yeah, absolute, but proportionally, I don't think so. Every
the amount that's being
website
produced is so ridiculous now. That
They have-
Okay.
What's that thing called? The Time Machine or something on the internet, where it's a non-for-profit, and all they do is catalog websites that actually exist, and they update it every day, so you can literally go see like what the U.S. Democratic Party's website said on this day in '94, whenever it existed.
So actually updating not just the websites, but the
I don't know how they do it, but their goal is basically to prevent what you and I are talking about. That like so many websites come and go, and they're there to keep a historical record, basically. But yeah, I don't know about that. I think
about the percentage.
Yeah, absolutely more crap is gonna make it. I agree, but I don't know. There's so much being produced.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
And I don't know, at this point it's so much easier for me as a nobody without a publishing deal to get my book out
Yes.
than it ever was before.
Yeah.
So, and then I imagine, 100 years down the line, no one's going to remember my little book. So,
yeah.
It's up in the air.
Are you working on a book?
No, I'm not. Not yet.
Let me read, I'm going to read a couple quick pages here from a text, and I think it'll be fairly straightforward what's going on here. Boyhood Deeds of our Lord Jesus Christ. I, Thomas the Israelite, am reporting to you, all my non-Jewish brothers and sisters, to make known the extraordinary childhood deeds of our Lord Jesus Christ, what he did after his birth in my region. This is how it all started. When this boy, Jesus, was 5 years old, he was playing at a ford of a rushing stream. He was collecting the flowing water into ponds and made the water instantly pure. He did this with a single command. He then made soft clay and shaped it into 12 sparrows. He did this on the Sabbath day, and many other boys were playing with him. But when a Jew saw that what Jesus was doing while playing on the Sabbath day, he immediately went off and told Joseph, Jesus' father, "See here, your boy is at the ford and has taken mud and fashioned 12 birds with it, and so he has violated the Sabbath." So Joseph went there, and as soon as he spotted him, he shouted, "Why are you doing what's not permitted on the Sabbath?" But Jesus simply clapped his hands and shouted to the sparrows, "Be off, fly away, and remember me, you who are now alive." And the sparrows took off and flew away noisily. The Jews watched with amazement, then left the scene to report to their leaders what they had seen Jesus doing. The son of Annas the scholar, standing there with Jesus, took a willow branch and drained the water Jesus had collected. Jesus, however, saw what had happened and became angry, saying to him, "Damn you, you irreverent fool! What harm do the ponds of waters do to you? From this moment you will dry up like a tree, and you'll never produce leaves or root or bear fruit." In an instant the boy was completely withered away. Then Jesus departed and left for the house of Joseph. The parents of the boy who had withered away picked him up and were carrying him out, sad because he was so young. And they came to Joseph and accused him. "It's your fault. Your boy did all this." Later he was going through the village again when a boy ran by and bumped him on the shoulder. Jesus got angry and said to him, "You won't continue your journey," and all of a sudden he fell down and died. Some people saw what had happened and said, "Where has this boy come from? Everything he says happens instantly." the parents of the dead boy came to Joseph and blamed him, saying, "Because you have such a boy, you can't live with us in the village, or else teach him to bless and not curse. He's killing our children." And it goes on from there. This is an early Christian text. One of the earlier Christian texts we have, not the earliest, but fairly early, of a Christian who wrote the boyhood adventures of Jesus. And
does he eventually become reverent?
He
sounds like
in this verse, he has a lot of bad behavior and he can't control his powers. But then by the end, he does control his powers, and at the final part, he's playing with a kid who gets injured, and he heals him, and it's all
way
good.
Cooler.
Yeah. So in the importance for those who are going to be having conversations about the New Testament and early Christian writings is that this sort of writing, and very few people today would argue that this is a real text, or that Thomas, who was probably an associate of Jesus's, was the author of this text. But it was common, just like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, to create these sorts of documents. And so, because of that prevalence, there's a lot of accounts. If you look at just the total number of accounts of Jesus and people around Jesus that were written in the 200 or 300 years after him, it's a substantial body of work, just like that. So figuring out what is pseudepigraphical and what is not is significant. And pseudepigraphy, we basically have already defined it, but it's where you write, when someone writes a text in the name of another actual person, that looks as if, for one reason or another, looks as if it was the real person, but it's actually not. And all of these that we've been looking at are pseudepigraphy, and the Diary of Abraham Lincoln, The Adventures of Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Do they know who is the generally accepted author of this? Is it even someone from within Jesus' lifetime or Thomas's lifetime?
Yeah, I think most people would say it's a 2nd century text. So it's not super early, but it's pretty early.
He's writing as Thomas to get credibility because Thomas would know that stuff.
Probably, yeah.
Whereas this guy probably wasn't even alive.
Yeah. And if you look at the table, there are several examples of debates over pseudepigraphy. This is a much bigger deal than some of the earlier ones, where there's not a whole lot of debate. There's a lot of debate on this one. And so you'll see it's in that 5th column. Some of them are gray. That's because they're anonymous, so they couldn't be pseudepigraphical. But the ones that aren't gray, you'll see a chunk of pseudepigraphy, of debate over pseudepigraphy among them. So in those texts, in this context of other texts, like what this text is, it's called the Proto-Evangelium of Thomas, are all... There's just a lot of conversation about pseudepigraphy within this whole broader body of documents. All right, so I'm pretty much at the end here. I'll skip over. There's one. Yeah, there's a couple pieces of material I can skip over. Let's wrap up then with the number 6, which is traditional attribution. And traditional attribution is where the group exercise comes into play. And it looks like, well, I was looking, so this is why we did the exercise. I was looking for just one thing. And it looks like one person got it, one person didn't. The thing that matters that's not in the original is the title. When we look at the first gospel, the first person who wrote it did not put the gospel according to Matthew. That's not a phrase from the original. We assign it that name, and when it's published, it's traditionally published under that name. That is traditional attribution, where you have an anonymous text, and this is why you see that
all the Gospels.
everything everything in column 5 and everything in column 6,
Yeah.
either one or the other is gray, because a text is either anonymous or it's not. And so if it's not anonymous, then you would have a possible pseudepigraphy. If it's anonymous, you would have a possible traditional attribution. Traditional attribution may or may not be correct, but once a traditional attribution becomes prevalent enough, then you'll start seeing things published under names and so forth, and then there'll be a question as to whether that traditional attribution is correct or not. Notice this is the only one of the 6 that has nothing to do with the author himself, in the sense that if this is an issue, it's an issue not with what the author was doing, but what later people who created the traditional attribution did. Any thoughts on that? All right, that one's fairly straightforward, and there's tons.
Is that really the only thing that was not original in that?
Oh, there's all the.
I marked out anything that seemed to be a summary because I assumed the original didn't have it. And coming from my Old Testament background, I know they do list 30 generations of people's names, so I think that's legit. But I don't think they would have included the females, except for Mary.
In terms of the original, yeah, what's missing? I can hand these back. I don't know which is which, but what's not in the original is the footnotes are not in the original. Page number, the cross-referencing column on the side, the heading, the genealogy of Jesus, and then those numbers is not in the original. The title's not in the original. None of the numbers are in the original. Code numbering of lines is assigned later. The footnote notations are not in the original, and all the text is original. Except for, you'll see footnote C there. That's assigned to. This is actually a good example of what we were talking about earlier about textual variants. I can't even. The third to bottom line of the third paragraph says Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah. That double Amos right there. It's saying what these translators are saying is, look, we've reviewed all the manuscripts. Everything, there are no variants on this entire page other than that. Those two words, and some, we're saying most likely the original said Amos, but it said some early texts read Ammon.
Nice.
That's it, for that entire page.
Yeah,
and that's common. When you read...
Yeah. There's always going to be issues.
Yeah. So that is that. Let me just reference people quickly to the to discussion 5. We are moving now into a 2-part discussion of miracles, and what we're going to do, the group exercise for next time is about a page. I've selected 2 miracles. The first, we're going to look first at the most widely believed, the most widely believed in miracle in the United States to have occurred in the United States, and then we're going to look at the most controversial miracle in the United States. The first is the prophecy of Joseph Smith. The second is the resurrection of Jesus. And so what I have, the group exercise for next time, there are some affidavits that were essentially written by several people who are reporting that they saw Smith talking to God and or the angel. And these are they're very famous texts. And they're affidavits written by these people. I have some more information.
From the Book of Mormon, the Book of Nephi, or whatever?
These affidavits are customarily published when the Book of Mormon is published in the prefix. Those affidavits will be published. They're called the testimony of the 3 witnesses and the testimony of the 8 witnesses, and they will from very early on they will be published alongside the Book of Mormon. Yeah. All right, so
my only New Testament I got from the Mormons.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I wanted one, and it's got a lovely picture of white Jesus in the front.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Very white. Very white.
All right.
Blue eyes, I think.
So that is that. Hi, this is Everett DePangher, and I am recording a supplement to the March 1st discussion 4 of Deeper Questions. We had such a good conversation that I needed to cut out a little bit of material, so I thought I would add this into the YouTube version of the conversation. I wanted to just cover three topics fairly quickly. The first is I wanted to talk a little bit more about an example of pseudepigraphy, and we'd gone through several during the discussion, including Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, and others. But I wanted to talk about one that in real life caused some real confusion because it was an example of pseudepigraphy that ended up not being handled well, at least in I think the opinion of a lot of people who were really familiar with the issue. And that was a situation that occurred, and some people may remember this, back in 2006. When there was a lot of media attention because of the discovery of a document that was being called the Gospel of Judas. And that's a reference to Judas Iscariot, who is someone who we'd have to look into other texts quite a bit to get a better sense of him, but he's portrayed in early Christian documents as being someone who had been a follower of Jesus who then had a falling out with him. And so at first impression, when someone hears the Gospel of Judas, one may think that it is certainly the writings of Judas Iscariot written from the perspective of someone who was a critic of Jesus during his lifetime. And the media reported this. It got a fair amount of attention, and it became quite a bit more sensational than it really needed to be. Scholars all along realized that this was a much later pseudepigraphy and that it had no connection to the man Judas Iscariot. Nonetheless, there was some confusion generated because of its pseudepigraphical nature and confusion over what it means to be a pseudepigraphical text. For instance, National Geographic printed a cover story in which it had a big headline, The Judas Gospel, and then in much smaller print as a subheadline it said, Decoding the Secrets of a 1700-year-old Text. Well, if you think about that, the big operative word there, or phrase there, is 1700, because if that was published in 2006, so 1700 years back from 2006, that's around the year 305 CE. And whatever we know about Judas Iscariot, we know that he would have been dead for more than 250 years by that point. Now it could be that other scholars would date that text earlier and thus make it maybe 1800 years ago or something like that. But nonetheless, what National Geographic was doing there, just to be frank, is it was making a big deal out of the Judas Gospel because Judas Iscariot is a sensational figure, and then burying in the fine print there, and by the way, this is a pseudepigraphical text that in its own view was written over 250 years after the death of the author named in the pseudepigraphy. So it's important to just keep in mind when you're looking at text, when you're looking at possible pseudepigraphy, what you're looking at, and just be careful, particularly of mainstream media reports, because, and this is not a criticism of them, but journalists are laymen who often report on fields that are very technical outside the field of their expertise, and so you just have to be appreciative of that fact when you're reading these sorts of issues in the mainstream media. The second issue I wanted to bring up was related to the pseudepigraphy discussion, although it's not itself pseudepigraphy, and that's I read a passage from the early Christian text, the Proto-Evangelium of Thomas, also called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is written by an early Christian and was a narrative of the boyhood adventures of Jesus. And in that text, which I said during the discussion is most people would say it's probably a 2nd century text, there is a portion in which Jesus is, as a young boy, is playing with some clay birds. He's molded some clay into the shape of birds, and then he animates them. He brings them to life. And for those who are listening to that, that may, or for some people at least, should have brought a rather distinct connotation, because in the Quran there is a very similar depiction of Jesus. And I wanted to just bring that to your attention, because for those of you who are more interested in the scripture conversations and deeper questions more generally, but are in the midst of conversations with friends and family that are more Quranically based, I just wanted to bring this out, just make a note of this for you. In Surah 3, around verse 49, Jesus makes the statement, Jesus is quoted as making the statement, "I bring you a sign from your Lord. From clay I will make for you the likeness of a bird. I shall breathe into it, and by God's leave it shall become a living bird." And then later, in Surah 5, around verse 110, God is speaking to Jesus, and God's statement is, God will say, "Jesus, son of Mary, remember the favor I bestowed on you and on your mother, how I strengthened you with the Holy Spirit so that you preached to men in your cradle and in the prime of manhood, how I instructed you in the book and in wisdom, in the Torah and in the gospel, how by my leave you fashioned from clay the likeness of a bird and breathed into it so that by my leave it became a living bird." So that is a very interesting overlap between the infancy gospel of Thomas and the Quran. And the Quran comes from the revelations that Muhammad reported in the early 7th century. So the question for someone who is dealing with these issues, again, focused more on Quranic issues, is what is this relationship between the 2nd century account of Jesus animating clay birds and this revelation in the 7th century about Jesus animating clay birds? So I just wanted to make a note of that. It's an interesting question. If we were studying the Quran more extensively in this series, we would certainly be spending quite a bit more time on the infancy gospel of Thomas and looking into that issue a bit more. The third thing I wanted to bring up was I just wanted to go over traditional attribution in a bit more detail. I had said during the conversation that the first canonical gospel is labeled either Matthew or the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew. It's printed under slightly different versions in English, or the title is. But typically it will be printed with this title, Matthew. And I said that that title is added because of traditional attribution. I just wanted to explain a little bit more about what that means. The text itself does not have any what we would call a foreword or an introduction. There's no point at which the author says, "I wrote this because," and then gives some discussion or a meta-discussion, if you will, of the reasons for writing the text. In fact, there's no first-person account at all. It is a fully third-person text, and from stem to stern is an account of Jesus without the author discussing himself at all. On 2 occasions within the text, and if you turn to page 26 in the materials, I have some more information on this. on two occasions in the text, there is a person named Matthew who is referenced. At one point, Jesus is said to, quote, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And then shortly thereafter, there is a list in the text of Jesus' disciples. And in that list is Matthew the tax collector. So those two references are the total references to Matthew in the text itself. And if you looked at other Gospels, the second Gospel carries no reference to a man named Mark at all, and it is also a fully third-person narrative account. Luke does have, in the third Gospel that we traditionally attribute, and through traditionally attribution label Luke, it does have introductory material that we looked at in some detail, in the materials at least, in discussion 2. But it's nonetheless is anonymous in that the author never identifies himself, and the name Luke does not appear in the text itself. Now that becomes a more complicated situation because that text is closely associated with the text that we often call the Acts of the Apostles, in which the author there's significant chunks of first-person narrative, although there's not a name there either. So all that is to say that when you're looking at a text that has traditional attribution, and you're having a discussion with someone, and whether you're arguing that the traditional attribution is correct or the traditional attribution is incorrect, whichever side of that you're on in that particular conversation, you will be looking at extra-textual information in the course of that conversation, because it will be from other texts about that text, but not the text itself, that you would be coming to your view about whether or not the traditional attribution is correct or incorrect. And so that requires a broader field of study. And this is why, back in discussion 2, when I introduced the letter of the elder, which I then later said was bore through traditional attribution the label 3rd John, why we couldn't get into the subject while discussing the text itself, because it's only through extra-textual information that was beyond the scope of our conversation at the time that you could address that issue. And we started when we looked at the Muratorian canon, which discusses a lot of traditional attribution, or assigns traditional attribution to a lot of texts. Then at that point you can start to see some of that extra-textual information and evidence. But just bear in mind that in that particular case, when you're discussing traditional attribution, unlike all the other of the six questions we discussed, that is the only one which will be strictly based on extra-textual evidence. So with that, we will be turning on March 15th to our first of a two-part discussion on miracles.